Greetings and como mai and nuhne, my fellow Star Trek fans. I am Captain Kanaka, the Trek historian, and I gotta tell ya, it's good to be back. I have a couple lost treks and a couple commentary videos that I wanted to do over the summer, and I wanted to start off with this one right here. This is a very special video for me. I had every intention of getting it done in May for reasons that are going to become clear in a moment. But with my obligations as a school teacher, that just wasn't going to happen. So, with that said, really excited to share my perspective on this topic that is so near and dear to my heart. Now, Star Trek has done a tremendous job of portraying different cultures over the almost 60-year history it's had. And that inclusion is so empowering to so many different people, myself included. In the interest of full disclosure, folks, I'm coming to this video as a Pacific Islander, Hispanic, Latino individual on the autistic spectrum. And as a lifelong Star Trek fan, it kind of seems that my favorite science fiction universe has been depicting certain aspects of my culture in reverse. For example, I fell in love with characters like Data and Spock because the subtext of those characters is neurodivergence and the autistic spectrum. Now, while these characters weren't on the spectrum, their thought processes and mannerisms resonated with me in such a profound way growing up that I actually borrowed their behaviors as a way to come to terms with my condition. However, since it took over 50 years to portray a Hispanic Latino character in the Star Trek universe in any meaningful role, I am unilaterally spearheading an initiative to push for the inclusion of my other ethnicity to be featured on the show because the absence of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in the Star Trek universe has annoyed me for years. Now, since a possible explanation for why a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character is not featured in modern Star Trek is because the writers fear the A word might apply here, I have offered my own perspective and historical insights as a set of instructions for writers on modern Star Trek to include a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character who is not only culturally authentic by modern standards, but whose inclusion in the futuristic world of Star Trek serves as an empowering message for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders living in the present. So let's get started by laying out the prime directive for success. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we need to acknowledge that Star Trek is extremely popular because of its positive depiction of every aspect of humanity. I'm sorry if this sounds redundant or rudimentary or obvious, but I honestly believe that the writers of modern Star Trek have forgotten this fundamental fact, and they need to acknowledge this fundamental fact if they're going to respectfully include a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character in the future. Not to mention, it could be a good course correction for the entire franchise moving forward. That's the signature aspect of Star Trek. It's a positive future in which every member of humanity is depicted to their fullest potential. The best example of this is the impact Lieutenant Uhura had on people of color during the original series. I'm always reminded of this quote of Whoopi Goldberg in which she recalls how Lieutenant Uhura's positive depiction of African Americans in the 23rd century was so empowering to her. The potential exists for the same thing for members of the Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian community, and this is how you do it. Step 1, the character's name. If you're going to authentically include a Native Hawaiian on Star Trek, there are two common ways in which you can approach that task. The first is traditional naming rights. Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but a traditional legal Hawaiian name has the following components: a Western, or if you prefer Christian-sounding first name, a Christian or Western middle name, a second Hawaiian middle name, and the surname. Now, to the uninitiated, this might sound like the purest form of appropriation, but I can 100% assure you that it is not. This tradition is in keeping with a royal decree given by King David Kalakaua, the last king of Hawaii and its second to last ruler. Now, before Hawaii was annexed by the United States, it was its own kingdom, hoping to emerge as a modern nation on similar footing with the United States and Great Britain by the 20th century. In an attempt to accomplish that goal, King David Kalakaua decreed that all Hawaiians must name their children using a blending of traditional Hawaiian and westernized modern culture. And when the king said you did something in Hawaiian culture, you did it. You don't want to know what happens to those who break the rules, folks. Then, starting in the 1970s during the Hawaiian Renaissance, a new style of naming became popular known as the Inoa Mikanele, or missionary name, in which people name their children using Hawaiianized versions of the Western/Christianized names the missionaries had. To those who may not know, these are the kinds of authentic Hawaiian names people might know today, like Kimo for James or Kavika for David. Now folks, either the traditional naming rights or the Inoa Mikanele could work in creating a character. Personally though, in keeping with Star Trek's optimistic vision of the future, I prefer the authentic traditional rights set out by King David Kalakaua as an indicator of how Hawaiian traditions have survived to the 25th and or 32nd century. Not to mention, naming a character through the traditional rites give a chance to reach out and tell the audience the 7 different ways in which Hawaiians get their names. Think of the characterizations that could be had from that. Think of the stories. Think of the educational value that kind of inclusion has. Because Season 1 of Star Trek Picard offended me so immensely, I actually rewrote the first season and have included a Native Hawaiian character on my version of the show to emphasize this point. So I would like to introduce you to Dr. Joseph David Ke'olakoa Ona Lahui Kakua, Chief Medical Officer on the USS Destiny. Now, I specifically picked this Hawaiian name to serve this character for a very specific reason. So if you'd like to let me know in the comments what you think the name means and the naming right that I picked in creating the character, please let me know. I'd love to hear your theories. So, with that said, we go to my second point. The second aspect of including a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character in Star Trek is to have the person be fluent in multiple languages, namely 3. For example, in my rewritten version of Star Trek Picard, Dr. Kakua speaks 3 languages: Federation Lingua Franca, Pidgin English, which is a combination of English with Hawaiian grammar, and proper traditional Hawaiian language. This is extremely important, folks. Because of countless years, bordering on centuries, of restrictions and forced assimilation, the Hawaiian language is at an existential crisis. It may not survive to the future generation. So by having Dr. Kakua or any other kind of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character on Star Trek speak Hawaiian fluently, that sends a significant message to the community that our traditions and values will still survive. I also have Dr. Kakua speak Pidgin English in my version of Star Trek Picard because it serves as a training tool to the audience. Pidgin English is English spoken with Hawaiian grammar. This dialect of English dates back to the sugarcane era, in which people from multiple different cultures had to work together to harvest sugar in Hawaii, and they needed a common language to speak. So they spoke English with Hawaiian grammar and whatever vocabulary from any present language that took the fewest syllables to articulate. So that's the second directive for creating a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander character in the Star Trek universe. Now, this third directive could be considered the linchpin because if you don't get this part right, the entire system could collapse. And it's fairly easy to do. Directive number 3, get the appearance right. Please, I beg of you. The key to making a positive depiction of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders is to not make the character look like Maui from Moana or any other kind of stereotypical depiction of a Pacific Islander. We don't all look like that. And I guarantee you, if you mess this one up, Almost everything about that character, including the well-intentions that it does get right, could be completely spoiled. Need I remind you of the debacle with Moana? So do yourself a favor, hire a young, attractive, unknown Asian American Pacific Islander actor and let it go from there. Have that positive depiction fuel the empowerment for the next generation. So those are my thoughts. I'm very curious to hear what yours are. Let me know in the comments below if you have translated Dr. Kakua's Hawaiian name. Please also let me know if you're interested in seeing my rewrite of Star Trek Picard. I'm really excited to show it for you folks. I'm really passionate about approaching the same topics that they did, but in a more constructive way. And if there's interest, that'll be my summer project. So with that in mind, e malama pono, live long and prosper, and see you in the next video.